Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I want to thank the Paradox family and Pastor Craig for the honor of this opportunity for me to be up here and to share with you some thoughts that I have about Galatians. And I see that some of my professors are in the audience, so I better watch what I'm saying this morning. The title of my talk is Sacred Anarchy, God's Expansive Solidarity. And I'll explain what I mean by sacred anarchy in just a moment. But before I begin, I thought I should say a little bit about who I am and where I'm coming from. I'm a 1.5 generation Taiwanese American. And among the many different things that means is that I'm a product of two very distinct cultures. And I grew up in Taiwan and I left at an age where I was just old enough to not really feel like I truly belong in either culture. On a spiritual level, I also grew up in a multi-religious home. My mother is a culturally Buddhist by cultural inheritance, and my father is a Muslim. And so I remember growing up, I have these very fond memories of going to the local mosque in Taiwan for prayer service, as well as visiting many different Buddhist temples with my mom, doing different kinds of rituals. So that kind of sets the tone of my life moving forward as well, because I always feel like I inhabit a space in between traditions, in between cultures. Never really feel like I truly fit in anywhere. When I immigrated to the United States, I went to an Adventist academy, high school, where I decided that I was going to become an Adventist evangelist. I was a very traditional Adventist, so I decided to go study theology in college. I went to La Sierra, probably the wrong choice. I'm so sorry, professor. Where all the beliefs that I thought I had were brutally deconstructed and reconstructed. It was an agonizing experience, but it was so necessary for me to start developing a critical posture towards the beliefs that I had inhabited for so long. I was still committed, though, to going into pastoral ministry, and so I spent many years on and off as a pastor, realizing that it became spiritually unsustainable for me for many reasons, among which is the reality that I have to leave so much of who I am behind in order to feel like I can serve and to appear presentable to the people that I was serving. And so I left pastoral ministry, and that drove me into an existential crisis. I didn't know what to do at that point. I didn't know what to do. That was what I was preparing to do. I didn't know who I was anymore. Some people deal with their existential crisis by watching Netflix and playing video games. But what I did is I joined the military, and I enrolled in a doctoral program to study religion. But even after all of those experiences, and studying religion, studying the world religious traditions, I continue to feel like all the different labels that I have used to define myself, Christian, American, Asian, man, whatever it may be, they were all much more complicated than I had thought. So I continue to feel like I really didn't truly belong anywhere. So in my spiritual journey, I have inhabited so many different positions. I went from a very traditional Christian to an atheist, to an agnostic, to a humanist. I attended so many different meetings. I remember going to one where Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, was speaking, and everybody was standing up with the God delusion saying, "This is the truth that I have found." To discover that fundamentalism can take many different shapes and forms, including in many of the spaces where I didn't expect. So needless to say, I have a pretty complicated relationship with the Christian tradition, and that is where I'm coming from today. And that is one of the reasons why I'm very fascinated, always been very fascinated with the Apostle Paul. Because he seems like a person who didn't really fit neatly into any box. Now, that may come across as surprising because Paul is known to be an author of so much of the New Testament. But at the same time, if you think about it, Paul was a pretty recent convert to the way of Jesus in his own time. Many of the disciples knew Jesus when he was alive. And yet he had the audacity to go to Peter, for instance, in the Galatians, where he talks about it, and tell him to his face that he's being a hypocrite, that he didn't really get what the gospel was all about. He used to persecute the Christians as a very strict Pharisee. So he seems to be someone who is a little bit of a maverick and didn't really fit in anywhere. And the community to which that he was writing to, Galatians, also seems to be a group of people who didn't really fit neatly into any boxes. One of the things that I have learned from my experience of being someone who didn't fit in anywhere is that sometimes there's a wisdom to looking at your tradition from that standpoint of not really fitting in anywhere. And that I think that is one of the reasons why Paul was able to glimpse at something powerful at the core of Jesus' message that even so many of his own disciples, when Jesus was alive, missed. And that Galatians then was written by someone who's somewhat of an outsider to a group of people who didn't really belong. It is within this context that I think this passage that is so famous is so important. That there's no longer Jew or Greek, there's no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Jesus Christ. In other words, all of the different boundaries and boxes that we human beings have constructed in order to divide people into insider, outsider, oppressor, oppressed, all of those borders that we have erected along religious, ethnic, national, racial lines are now being deconstructed because of a new reality is dawning. The reality that Paul calls the new creation is as a result of what Jesus has accomplished in Jesus' faithfulness. So the thesis, if I were to boil it down, is something like this. All the old boundaries of religion, ethnicity, nationality, race have been broken down, and social status are now being dismantled by a new reality that came into existence as a result of the faithful life that Jesus has lived in his life, in his death, and his resurrection. And as a result, the followers of Jesus now, being empowered by the power of the Spirit of freedom, are invited to step into that new reality, the new creation, that is so radically different from anything that we have seen before. That is the thesis of Galatians. So I'm using the word faithfulness in a very particular way here, very intentional way. The reason is, in a Protestant theological context, we often hear about faith in Jesus, right? Or salvation by grace through faith. And the word here is pistis. Let me hear you say pistis. It does work, Pastor Craig. Right? Pistis Jesu Christo is the original Greek phrase. Sometimes it's translated into faith in Jesus Christ. But if we do that, sometimes faith in our English language may come across as giving intellectual assent to a list of propositions, right? Theological propositions, or a certain kind of metaphysics. But if we look at the original context, pistis can mean a lot of different things. It could mean trust, conviction, fidelity, loyalty, and allegiance. Christo is the Greek word for the Hebrew word Mashiach, which means the anointed one. And this is really important because in Paul's time, the Roman emperor, the Caesar, right, demanded that the Roman subjects worship him as the Son of God. And what Caesar demanded of Roman subjects was precisely pistis, allegiance to the Roman Empire. So to say faithfulness of Christ or allegiance to this new reality in Jesus Christ is actually a very seditious and dangerous claim. It's a political claim. And if we forget the connotation of allegiance, we might miss that political context of what this phrase actually means. So pistis Jesu Christo can sometimes be translated allegiance to Jesus or the faithfulness of Jesus. And it is within this context that I want to provide a short and brief overview of what Paul's argument in the letter to the Galatians is. In the first two chapters, Paul begins by trying to defend the authenticity and the authority of his message. He wants to make sure that his listeners know that he's not just saying these radical things to sound cool or to please other people, but it's in fact a message that is coming straight from God. And in the process, he points out something that is really important, the central problem that he was wrestling with, which is that there is a particular faction of Jewish followers of Jesus who was pressuring Gentile followers of Jesus, or non-Jewish followers of Jesus, to conform to the Jewish standards of worship and social belonging. And a couple of those things include to keep a very strict understanding of the Torah, for the man to be circumcised, right, to keep a Jewish diet, and to refrain from table fellowship with those who are not Jewish. Now, this is one of the things that Paul was arguing with Peter about, because Peter used to fellowship with non-Jewish people around the table. But he walked that back. And Paul is saying to Peter, you're a hypocrite. If you really believe in the message of Jesus, of this radical reality that is coming into existence, that deconstructs all the borders that divides us, then that is not an appropriate way to embody that message. So, in the next two chapters, then Paul goes on to talk about examining the Jewish scriptures, the Torah, arguing that God's plan from the get-go has always been the healing of all nations. God didn't call the people of Israel to make a group feel special about themselves, but to contribute to the healing of all nations and the transformation of all of creation. And the Torah, while being a product of God's grace and is a great thing, was not sufficient for that task. Because while religious boundaries and borders that we draw up may serve a particular function in some context, in the formation of a unique people, is also somewhat of a double-edged sword, right? It can make people feel like they're more righteous and better than other people. And so for Paul, then, that could actually undermine what God's plan was actually all about. So in the story of Israel itself, there's an image of a God who has always been wanting to heal all of creation, all people, not just Jews. And then in the next two chapters, Paul paints a picture of what that new reality looks like. What does it mean for us to step into that new creation? And for Paul, that means living a life that embodies a boundary-crossing kind of love. A boundary-crossing solidarity that is so radical that has never been seen before. So you might be wondering then, why is there so much pressure for early Christians, especially for non-Jewish Gentile Christians, to conform to these Jewish markers of social belonging? And I think this is important because we need to understand a little bit about the political and social context of Galatians. So one thing to remember is that it is very prevalent in Rome and Roman subjects to engage what is so-called the cult of the emperor, meaning that the emperor demands to be worshipped as one of the gods. On top of that, there are also various local deities that faithful Roman subjects will also participate in this ritual worship of local deities. Now, these are not just private matters, these are public civic matters, because the worship of local deities and the emperor is seen as a public health kind of measure, right? Because these local deities and the emperor is seen as the protectors of the flourishing and the health of the Roman Empire and these various communities and villages. So if you're that one family who doesn't engage in these ritual worship of local deities and the emperor, and something bad happens, like a flood or a fire, whatever it is, a drought, right? You can bet everybody in that community is going to blame you for not participating in that ritual worship. So all the disaster that could possibly happen, it becomes a scapegoat, creates a scapegoating mechanism for people who don't participate in that worship. So that's one of the pressures why there's a lot of Gentile Christians had to contend with when they decide that they're going to become monotheists, meaning that they're going to worship one God. Now, there's another group of people, Jewish people, known by the Roman Empire to be a group of monotheists. So Rome, while very brutal, oppressive, right, they were also very pragmatic. So that means that they have given special exemptions for the Jewish community in the Roman Empire to not have to participate in emperor worship as well as the worship of local deities. Now, with the caveat that they pray for the emperor of Rome to their God, Yahweh. But that political settlement was also very fragile. As you imagine, not everybody in authority agreed with that. Certainly not the entire population. So you can be sure if something bad happens, you might still get blamed for not participating in civic worship. But it is important to note that the Jewish people had a special exemption from the authorities to not have to do those things. So think about it. Now emerges this group of people who were not Jewish, but also wanting to claim to be a monotheist, the early followers of Jesus who were not Jewish. Now, lots of people were kind of scared. Say, people in authority are saying, oh, look at, Emperor, now you gave these special exemptions to the Jews. Now there's more and more people wanting this special exemption. So maybe we should get rid of it altogether, right? So then there's a lot of pressure for the early church community to try to conform to Jewish forms of worship so that they look more like the Jews. And so that doesn't unsettle the arrangement that they have with the Roman Empire. A second pressure comes from the rigorous keepers of the Torah, to which Paul was a member of, the Pharisees. That group of people believed that in order for the Messiah to return and to liberate the Jewish people from Roman oppression, they needed to keep a very strict understanding of the Torah and the law. So if anybody deviates from keeping the law in the way that they interpreted it, it was seen as dangerous and even traitorous. And sometimes they wouldn't be sad about using coercion and even violence to compel people to follow their way. So this is the pressure that the early non-Jewish Christian followers of Jesus were facing. And that is why it was so important when Peter made a decision to walk back table fellowship with the Gentiles. It was so important. Perhaps part of the pressure is him being pragmatic, that we don't want to make people upset. We don't want to upset the safety of the community. But Paul's answer to all of these different political pressures is very radical. Is an absolute no. No to empire conformity. No to social, political, religious gatekeeping. And underneath both of these no's is a radical yes to Jesus' new creation, characterized by boundary crossing, inclusion, and love, which I would like to call sacred anarchy. And let me explain what I mean by that. Anarchy contains the word archy, right? It comes from the word archo, which has the connotation of to rule or to rule over. And if you think about the word monarchy, right? Monarchy literally means the rule of one. But within the connotation of the word archo is also this idea that you're exercising power over, to rule over in a dominating way, another group of people. And so to say that, the word anarchy, right, a no to archy means the absolute rejections of any kind of power exercised to oppress people and to divide people. God's power in the imagination of Paul, I would argue, is a kind of power that shakes people free from these kinds of boundaries and divisions. It is a power that challenges all forms of domination, all forms of oppression, because of the dawning of the new creation is characterized by boundary-crossing love, joy, and radical solidarity. And that is the new reality that Paul is calling the followers of Jesus to step into boldly, even if it means that it is politically inconvenient. In a time when the Roman emperor was demanding to be worshipped as God, right? As we can see that the deification of political leaders is not a modern American phenomenon, right? It is something that happens a long time ago. And Paul's answer to that is an absolute no. And I think Father Greg Boyle says it best, the founder of one of the largest gang intervention and rehabilitation center in LA, Homeboys Industries. He says that inching ourselves closer to creating a community of kinship such that God might recognize it. Soon we imagine with God this circle of compassion. Then we imagine no one standing outside of that circle, moving ourselves closer to the margins so that the margins themselves will be erased. We stand here with those whose dignity has been denied. We locate ourselves with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. At the edges, we join the easily despised and the readily left out. We stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. We situate ourselves right next to the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. We stand at the margins. We're called to stand at the borders of these divisions and boundaries, precisely because so that we can erase them, we can dismantle them. That is the radical calling of this boundary crossing love that Paul's letter is pointing to. So I want to connect Paul's message in Galatians to a story of someone that I really admire. Her name is Yuri Kochiyama, Japanese American, towering figure during the Civil Rights Movement. Yuri's story, though, didn't begin with a cause, but with a wound. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, FBI agents went to Yuri's home, knocking on her door, barged in, ransacked the place, went into her father, Seiichi Nakahara's room, where he was resting, having returned from the hospital, having undergone a medical procedure. Now, Seiichi was very ill for a variety of reasons. He had diabetes and many other health struggles that he had to contend with. But the FBI agent didn't say anything to the family, dragged him out of the bed, took him away, and Yuri was in shock, didn't know what was happening. Later on, she told her mom, Suyako, about it. And they had to find an attorney in order to even determine where her father was. He was detained there for weeks, was denied medication, right? And even when they put him into clinic for treatment, they put on his body prisoner of war, for no other reason than the fact that he was Japanese ancestry. It was so bad. Later on, they found out he was suspected of being a spy for Japan, for no other reason than his ethnicity. Weeks later, he was finally released, probably because the people in authority knew that he was going to die soon. He was released 2 days before he passed away. Back to his home, he was delirious. He was in and out of consciousness. He didn't know who anyone was at that point. 2 days later, he passed away. And Yuri's mother grieved and cried until there was no more tears to give. And their hardship didn't end here, because as with 120,000 Japanese Americans, they were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to concentration camps all across the United States. The particular one that their family went to is the Jerome Relocation Center in Arkansas. Horrible place, unsanitary, smelly, not up to living conditions at all. Brutal winters with no heating. That's where they will be living for the next 2.5 years. In the camp, Yuri met Bill Kochiyama, who will become her husband. They obviously had a connection, right? Their relations started to deepen and flourish. But Bill also had to leave because he had volunteered to fight on behalf of the United States in the Second World War. Many Nisei people did, second generation Japanese Americans, volunteered to fight for a country that has imprisoned their whole family. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard in your history lessons of this example of true patriotism. So the 442nd Battalion Regimental Combat Team was part of one of the most decorated battalions in history. It's called the Purple Heart Battalion. Lots of Nisei soldiers. That 442nd was made up of Nisei soldiers, right? Second generation Japanese Americans. They continued to exchange letters, Yuri and Bill, as the war went on. And during that process, Yuri had discovered that a lot of the other soldiers, the other Nisei soldiers, didn't receive letters from anybody. It was as if they were forgotten and left behind, despite them putting their lives at risk for a government that has imprisoned their families. So Yuri decided that she was not just going to write to Bill, she was going to write to everybody. So one letter became a dozen letters. She started a day school in the camp, and she gathered a bunch of students and their parents to write thousands and thousands of letters to everybody they could write to in the 442nd. And that rippled out outwards And many of them sent letters by saying that it is the letter that helped got me through some of the most difficult times in the war. And Bill and Yuri got married. After leaving the camp, they settled in Harlem, New York, where they had an apartment together. And Yuri found a job working at a local coffee shop. And in that local coffee, she was working side by side with African American workers. And in that context, she started to listen to their stories. The stories of segregation, stories of racism, stories of Jim Crow, stories of the rules that they have to follow in order to stay safe. And Yuri came to realize that oppression and racism can take many different forms. And she made a decision that she was going to fight for oppressed people no matter who they are. So she opened up her home to civil rights activists. Everybody knew in the movement that if you needed a place to stay, you just call up Yuri. She would oftentimes be in the back of workshops, just taking notes, learning about the history of a people that she at first wasn't familiar with. And then she opened up her home to gatherings of civil rights leaders and activists. They were starting to do workshops and teach-ins. And it is within this context that she became friends with Malcolm X, who was a frequent visitor of Yuri's home during this time, where he would give speeches and teach other fellow activists. Even when Malcolm X was traveling around the world, they continued to exchange letters, and they became very close and became each other's confidant. In 1965, in February, right before Malcolm was about to give his speech, gunshot was fired, and he was assassinated during that event. And when the gunshot happened, everybody ran towards the exit. But according to, in the words of Yuri's great-granddaughter, Yuri ran towards the stage. And there's a famous photo of Yuri cradling Malcolm's head as he lay dead on the floor. I didn't show that picture because it's pretty bloody. But she didn't stop there. She cried, and she keeps saying Malcolm's name, in that she grieved for the death of her friend. But her fight didn't end there. She continued to be a very powerful activist. She started to fight for the freedom of Puerto Rican independence, reparations for Japanese Americans, the freeing of political prisoners internationally. She fought for Muslim detainees in 9/11, after 9/11, and also the rights of incarcerated people all around the world. Yuri passed away in 2014, leaving behind a legacy of fighting for the freedom of everybody, knowing that the freedom of one people hinges on the freedom of everyone else. And I think Yuri's life embodies this kind of radical boundary-crossing love. As she crossed borders, as she connected in her own personal experience, the experience of oppressed people everywhere, engaged in risky love, because love is not always safe. Sometimes it requires us to take risks, and then to build a community, a safe haven for people who are in the same place. So I think Paul's message in Galatians is not abstract theology. It is a summons for us to step into that new reality, that bold boundary-crossing love. So where do we start? I think based on Yuri's experience, we can say we should start small. Yuri started her activism, I think, by writing a letter to the person that she loved. And she allowed that love to ripple outward, to include more and more people. Start small. Love somebody. Express that love and allow that love to ripple outward. And then secondly, she practiced radical listening. She started by being in the back of these rooms, learning, taking notes, listening to the stories of people that she was not familiar with at the time, internalizing their experiences, developing her empathy, listening, making space for people who are not the same as yourself. And then she practiced hospitality. And this could take many different forms. The hospitality of your heart, the hospitality of your time. Make room to create space, a safe space, for people who are vulnerable in your life, people who are hurting, people who are marginalized. You could take the form of opening up your home, as Yuri did, to be a safe space for people who are suffering. It could mean building movements, building something bigger, so that we can resist together and stand in solidarity with each other. It doesn't have to be dramatic. The lesson here, I think, is to start small and let that love ripple outward. So friends, as you leave worship today, may you go in love, go in courage, and go in solidarity. Thank you so much.